In this episode, we move from the idea of enterprise risk management, ERM, as a framework on paper into the much more practical question of what it looks like when an organization actually tries to use it. For beginners, this is where the subject often becomes easier, because broad principles start to make more sense once you can picture how leaders, managers, and teams apply them in real situations. ERM is not meant to be a decorative chart used only during board meetings or annual planning sessions. It is supposed to shape how the organization recognizes uncertainty, makes decisions, assigns ownership, and checks whether the risk process is helping rather than simply creating more meetings and documents. From a certified information systems auditor, CISA, perspective, this matters because an auditor is rarely satisfied by hearing that a framework exists. The real question is whether the framework has been implemented in a way that affects governance, operations, oversight, and control in the actual environment where the business runs. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A useful place to begin is with a simple truth that many organizations learn the hard way. ERM implementation does not start when someone opens a spreadsheet and begins typing risks into colored boxes. It starts when leadership decides that risk will be managed in a structured and visible way instead of through scattered judgment calls inside separate departments. That usually means defining who has authority to oversee the process, who owns major risks, how often information will be reviewed, and how risk issues will move upward when they become significant enough to affect strategy or enterprise performance. Without that foundation, teams may still talk about risk, but they will usually do so in inconsistent language and with inconsistent urgency. A beginner can think of this as the difference between a neighborhood where everyone drives according to personal preference and one where roads, signs, and traffic rules create a predictable pattern. Implementation is about creating that pattern so risk decisions become coordinated instead of accidental. Imagine a mid-sized company that sells products online and depends heavily on digital systems for customer orders, payment processing, inventory, and shipment tracking. Before implementing ERM, each department may already be aware of its own concerns. The finance team worries about fraud and billing errors, operations worries about shipping delays, IT worries about outages and aging systems, and legal worries about privacy and contract exposure. None of these concerns is imaginary, but if they remain isolated, senior leadership cannot easily tell which risks matter most to the enterprise as a whole or how one area's weakness might affect another. ERM implementation in this setting would begin by connecting those concerns to business objectives such as customer trust, reliable fulfillment, regulatory compliance, and sustainable growth. That shift is important because it moves the conversation away from isolated complaints and towards structured evaluation of what could prevent the enterprise from achieving what it is trying to do. Once objectives are clear, implementation usually involves gathering risk information in a more consistent way. This does not have to be a highly technical exercise for beginners to understand. Leaders and managers ask what could go wrong, what could change unexpectedly, where the organization is especially dependent on a system or vendor, and what events could cause financial, operational, legal, or reputational harm. In the online retail example, the organization might identify risks such as an extended system outage during a busy sales period, weak vendor performance in fulfillment software, inaccurate inventory data, loss of customer payment information, or a poor response to a major privacy complaint. The important point is not that the company has now discovered risk for the first time. The point is that the information is being collected in a common process and related to enterprise goals rather than remaining buried in local frustration or private technical concern. That is one of the clearest signs that ERM is becoming real. After risks are identified, the organization has to evaluate them in a consistent way, and this is where implementation often becomes more disciplined. Different organizations may use different scales or methods, but the high-level idea is straightforward. Management wants to understand how likely a risk is, how serious the consequences could be, how quickly the issue could affect the organization, and whether existing controls already reduce the danger to a tolerable level. In the retail example, a brief website slowdown may be annoying, but a multi-day outage during peak season could damage revenue, customer trust, and brand reputation all at once. A late software patch may matter, but an unreviewed change that affects payment transactions may deserve more urgent attention. ERM evaluation helps management compare very different risks using a shared lens, which supports better prioritization. For a CISA learner, this matters because strong management is not just identifying problems. It is deciding which problems deserve enterprise attention first and why. Response planning is where ERM begins to show whether it can influence decisions rather than merely describe exposure. Once a risk is understood, leadership and management have to decide what to do about it. They may reduce the risk by strengthening controls, avoid the activity that creates the risk, transfer part of the impact through insurance or contracts, or accept the risk within approved boundaries if the cost of additional treatment is not justified. In the retail company, management might reduce outage risk by improving resilience, reduce privacy risk by tightening data handling practices, transfer part of vendor-related exposure through clearer service agreements, or accept a limited level of delay in a low-impact internal process. The important thing for a beginner is to notice that ERM is not forcing one universal answer. It is creating a reasoned process for choosing among response options. Auditors look for evidence that those choices were made deliberately, approved at the right level, and aligned with the organization's risk appetite rather than with convenience alone. Documentation is another important part of implementation, but it helps to understand why documentation matters rather than assuming more paperwork always means more maturity. Most organizations maintain some form of risk register or equivalent record where important risks, owners, assessments, response plans, and status updates are captured. In a healthy program, that record is not just a static archive created once and forgotten. It becomes a working management tool that helps leadership see which risks remain open, which treatments are progressing, which decisions were approved, and where repeated delays or exceptions may signal a deeper problem. In our example company, a risk register might show that payment processing resilience has an assigned owner, a target improvement date, periodic reporting, and an acknowledged link to customer trust and revenue protection. For audit thinking, the key issue is not whether the register looks elegant. It is whether the information is current, useful, connected to decision-making, and supported by accountability that management actually takes seriously. Implementation also becomes stronger when ERM is integrated into ordinary business activity instead of being treated as a special event that occurs separately from everything else. A week program might hold quarterly meetings about risk while projects, system changes, vendor decisions, and budgeting choices continue without meaningful reference to the risk framework. A stronger program makes risk part of those existing decisions. For example, if the online retailer wants to launch a new mobile application quickly before the holiday season, ERM implementation would encourage leaders to discuss not only revenue opportunity, but also privacy implications, operational dependency, customer support readiness, vendor risk, and the effect of accelerated timelines on control quality. That does not mean innovation stops. It means the decision is made with wider awareness of consequences. This is one of the clearest examples of successful implementation because it shows the framework influencing real trade-offs rather than sitting in a separate compliance lane with limited practical effect. Third-party relationships provide another very useful example because many organizations depend heavily on vendors, cloud providers, payment processors, managed services, and outside software platforms. A beginner might assume vendor problems are mostly procurement issues, but ERM shows why they are enterprise issues. If a critical provider fails, the consequences may reach operations, compliance, customer experience, reputation, and financial performance all at once. In implementation terms, this means vendor dependence should not be hidden inside isolated contracts or technical ownership alone. In the retail company example, management might identify a shipping platform provider as a major dependency and evaluate what would happen if the service became unavailable during a surge period. A mature ERM process would ask who owns that risk, whether alternative arrangements exist, how contract protections work, how performance is monitored, and whether leadership understands the enterprise impact of failure. Evaluation then examines whether those questions are being answered consistently and whether vendor oversight really reflects the importance of the dependency. A healthcare example can make the same idea clearer from a different angle. Imagine a clinic network that depends on electronic patient records, appointment scheduling, billing systems, and secure communication with insurers and patients. In that environment, ERM implementation would not focus only on information security in the narrow sense. It would connect patient care, privacy obligations, operational continuity, staffing, legal exposure, and system reliability into one enterprise picture. A major outage would not just be an IT inconvenience. It could disrupt treatment, delay billing, increase compliance risk, and affect trust. If management uses ERM well, it evaluates those connections before a crisis forces the lesson painfully. It might identify concentration risk in one hosting provider, weak business continuity testing, or unclear ownership of patient data retention rules. For the auditor, the important question is whether the organization understands those enterprise effects and has implemented risk management in a way that supports decisions about continuity, accountability, and compliance across the full care environment. Evaluation is the other half of this topic, because even a well-designed implementation can weaken over time if no one checks whether it is working. Evaluating ERM means asking whether the process is complete enough, timely enough, and influential enough to help the organization make better decisions. A mature evaluation does not stop at confirming that meetings occurred or reports were distributed. It examines whether key risks are actually being identified, whether ownership is clear, whether response plans are progressing, whether leadership receives meaningful reporting, and whether business decisions show evidence that risk information is being considered. In the retail example, if the same website resilience issue appears quarter after quarter with no action, that suggests implementation weakness no matter how polished the risk report looks. Likewise, if serious vendor exposure is discussed only after an outage has already harmed the business, evaluation should question whether the program is proactive enough. CISA thinking often rewards this deeper view of effectiveness over mere existence. One way organizations evaluate ERM is through internal review, management assessment, or internal audit activity. The purpose is not to attack the framework, but to determine whether it is designed appropriately and operating as intended. Reviewers may examine whether risk criteria are consistent, whether risk owners understand their responsibilities, whether reporting reaches the right level, and whether treatment decisions align with policy and governance expectations. They may also compare what the risk process claims to cover with what is actually happening in project approval, vendor oversight, major change decisions, and incident escalation. In a healthcare network, for example, evaluators might discover that operational risk is discussed regularly, but privacy risk updates are fragmented, or that business continuity risks are tracked without meaningful testing evidence. These findings matter because they reveal gaps between framework design and real operation. From an audit perspective, this is often where the most valuable insights appear, since control weakness frequently hides in incomplete execution rather than in missing terminology. Metrics can support evaluation, but beginners should be careful not to confuse measurement with true effectiveness. Organizations may track overdue treatment plans, unresolved high-level risks, repeated exceptions, incident frequency, or other indicators to see whether the ERM process is revealing persistent weakness or improvement over time. Those indicators can be useful, but only if they are interpreted thoughtfully. A low number of reported risks is not always good news, because it may mean the organization is failing to surface issues honestly. A high closure rate may sound positive, yet it could hide superficial resolution if risks are being marked complete without durable treatment. In our retail example, leadership might see that many risks are closed quickly, but a closer review may reveal that recurring vendor and outage issues keep reappearing under slightly different names. Evaluation needs enough judgment to look beneath the numbers and ask whether the process is changing behavior, improving resilience, and helping leaders understand the true risk picture rather than simply producing attractive statistics. Another important part of evaluation is looking at culture, because ERM is only as strong as the environment in which people are expected to use it. If managers are rewarded for hiding problems, if risk ownership is treated as punishment, or if senior leaders pay attention only when an issue becomes a public embarrassment, then implementation will remain shallow regardless of how carefully the framework was designed. A healthier culture encourages open escalation, honest reporting, and realistic discussion about trade-offs and constraints. In the healthcare example, that could mean clinical leadership feels comfortable raising continuity concerns before patient services are disrupted, or privacy staff can speak frankly about weak data handling without being dismissed as obstacles. From an audit standpoint, culture may be harder to measure than a report or a policy, but it often explains why identical-looking risk programs perform very differently in practice. Evaluation, therefore, should consider not just documents and dashboards, but whether the organization's behavior supports transparent and timely risk management. A common misconception is that implementation success means the organization has built a perfectly complete program with every risk categorized, scored, and treated in an ideal way. Real organizations are messier than that, and ERM maturity grows over time. The more practical question is whether the enterprise is getting better at identifying what matters, assigning ownership, making informed choices, and learning from repeated weaknesses. Another misconception is that evaluation should focus mainly on the format of the framework instead of on its influence. An auditor is usually less interested in whether the risk committee presentation looks impressive than in whether major business decisions, technology changes, vendor relationships, and continuity preparations reflect actual risk awareness. That mindset is extremely useful for the CISA learner. It helps you look past the appearance of structure and ask whether the program is operating in a way that supports governance, strategy, and control across the enterprise in a meaningful and visible way. The central lesson should feel much more concrete. ERM implementation means taking risk management out of isolated conversations and embedding it into ownership, assessment, reporting, response, and decision-making across the enterprise. Evaluation means checking whether that process is real, current, influential, and honest enough to help leadership manage uncertainty instead of merely describing it after the fact. Whether you picture an online retailer, a healthcare network, or any other organization, the same broad ideas apply. Risk must be tied to objectives. Ownership must be clear. Responses must be deliberate, and oversight must examine whether the framework changes real behavior. For the CISA exam, that is the mindset to carry forward. The strongest answer is usually the one that strengthens implementation, improves evaluation, and connects risk management to the actual life of the organization rather than leaving it as a formal exercise that exists mostly on paper.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.